Welcome to everyone. My name is Nicholas Housen. I'm the Jiangba Li Professor of Law at the Michigan Law School, and I want to welcome you to our Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies noon lecture series. Today featuring, as I will say in a moment, our alumni Wang Yuhua. I want to begin with a couple of announcements. First from the center, and then I will introduce Professor Wang. First, on Monday, February 21st at 7 p.m., the CHOP film series of the Center for Chinese Studies will present Beethoven in Beijing, a feature-length documentary film being shown at the Michigan Theater in Ann Arbor. The presentation will include a post-film discussion with director and writer Jennifer Lin, along with a discussion with Tiffany Eng, Associate Professor in the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. The next presentation in this series, or the noon lecture series, will take place on Tuesday, February 15th, and will be given by Michelle Mattini, Assistant Professor of Art History at NYU, who will be speaking on glitches in art historical flow circa 1750. For the presentation we're about to start, I want everyone who's listening or attending to feel free to ask any questions, and you do that by clicking on there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you can write your questions, we will process them and pose them to Dr. Wang at the end of his remarks. So as I said at the beginning, today we are super delighted to have Wang Yuhua, who is the Frederick S. Danziger Associate Professor in the Department of Government at Harvard University. He's the author of one book that's already published and one that's coming out, which he'll speak to us about today. The first book is Tying the Autocrat's Hands, The Rise of the Rule of Law in China, which is Cambridge 2015. And forthcoming, of course, is The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, The Social Origins of State Development, which will be coming out from Princeton University Press this year. Wang Yuhua has his BA from Beida in Beijing, and of course his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. So Yuhua, welcome back, sort of, to Ann Arbor, and we really look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be back to Michigan, even just virtually. I still remember the day I knocked on Nico's door to ask him to be on my dissertation committee. And he had every reason to say no, but he said yes, and served on my committee, took me under his wings and taught me how Chinese law worked. So it's such an honor to be introduced by Nico. And that was my first book, finished at Michigan as a dissertation on Chinese rule of law. Today, I'm going to talk about my second book, which is on long-term state building in China. Let me just share my screen. The title of the book is The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, the Social Origins of State Development. And this is the cover of the book. You should certainly not judge the book by its cover, but it's a pretty good cover, and I really like it. I want to start the story with two individual emperors in Chinese history. The first one is Emperor Jingzong of the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty was from the early 7th century to the early 9th century, and Jingzong was one of their later emperors. And Jingzong became the emperor of Tang when he was 14 years old. He was a teenager in 824. But he sat on the throne for merely 3 years. You can see here in the year of 827, one day he went to the palace and he was assassinated by the elites, Caesar style. The second emperor is a famous one. This is the Qianlong emperor of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty started in the mid 17th century, ended in the early 20th century. And you all know this is the last dynasty in Imperial China. And the Qianlong emperor became the emperor of Qing when he was 24 years old in 1735. But he sat on the throne for over 60 years. In 1796, he abdicated and passed the throne to his son and lived for another 3 years and became one of the longest reigning monarchs in the whole world. if I just tell you the stories of these two emperors, you might infer about the nature of the dynasties they were ruling. For example, you might think that the Jingzong was probably ruling a violent dynasty, that people were killing each other, was chaotic, and you might think that the Qianlong Emperor was ruling this prosperous and stable dynasty. And anyone who knows about Chinese history knows that that's not true, exactly the opposite. That is, the Tang dynasty that Jingzong was ruling was the dominant power in the world. According to Madison, an economic historian, estimates Tang China occupied a quarter of the global GDP. The USA today occupies 1/16 of the global GDP. So that gives you a sense of how dominant the Tang economy was. On the other end of Eurasia, Europe at the time was the developing country. Europe was poor, violent, and chaotic. This is, after the fall of the Roman Empire, early stages of the Charlemagne. That was, a poor region of the world. Back to Tang China, the Tang government also had a lot of resources. The Tang government controlled the majority of land. This never happened in Chinese history before. Until 1950s, the Communist Party, through the land reforms, were able to control most of the land. But throughout Imperial China, Tang government, was able to control the majority of land. And then also, you probably have heard of the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads also originated in the Tang era. The Chinese merchants were able to structure international trade through the Silk Roads, which connected China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. Tang era was also the time when China had huge influence on its neighbors in Japan and Korea. For example, the religion, language, laws, and bureaucracy in those countries borrowed heavily from Tang China. On the other hand, the Qing dynasty that Qianlong was ruling was a declining power. Qing China occupied only 1/20 of the global GDP, so this is a huge decline from the Tang times. And in Europe at this time, Europe now became the developed world, right? This is, the 18th century, 19th century. Europe has almost finished the state building process and also is in the process of the Industrial Revolution. If we use taxation as a share of GDP to measure so-called state capacity, the capacity of the state, the Qing government was extremely weak. Qing taxation occupied less than 1% of the whole economy. And then according to the historians, in late Qing, the army could barely protect itself. The 8 banners, the green standards were very, very weak. This is also an era of mass rebellions and also foreign invasions. You all know that, the White Lotus rebellion happened in the late 18th century, and starting in the 19th century, China started to be defeated by Western powers. The Opium War started in the 19th century, and then in the late 19th century, China was defeated by Japan, and China almost became colonized, right? So the broader pattern from these two individual emperors is that we see a very weak emperor, the Jingzong emperor of Tang dynasty, ruled a very strong dynasty, and then a very strong emperor ruled a very weak dynasty, right? And this broader pattern is not only from these two case studies, it's also consistent with a larger data set that they collected over 2000 of years of Chinese history. This graph shows you the probability of being deposed by the elites among all the Chinese emperors, from the first emperor, the Qin Shi Huangdi, to the last emperor, the Puyi emperor in the Qing dynasty in the last 2000 years. And on the horizontal axis is the year of ascension, that the year they became an emperor. And then on the vertical axis is the probability of being deposed. The line here shows you the moving average of that probability. And you can see that in the first half of Imperial China, basically before the year 1000, Chinese emperors became increasingly insecure. And then up until the Tang dynasty, for example, almost half of the late Tang emperors were deposed by the elites, right? But the turning point happened at the end of Tang dynasty, between Tang and Song. Starting in the Song dynasty, in the second millennium, Chinese emperors became increasingly secure up until the Qing dynasty, where almost none of the emperors were deposed by the elites, right? You have this up and down in terms of ruler duration. But when we look at so-called state capacity is the opposite. That is, in the first millennium, up until the Tang Dynasty, the Chinese state was very strong. And then in the second millennium, from Song to Qing, Chinese state became increasingly weak. This is also based on the data I collected. The upper graph here shows you the fiscal policies, the major fiscal policies in the last 2,000 years. And on the horizontal axis is the year, and on the vertical axis is my coding of those policies. The way I code those policies is based on how historians thought about those policies. For example, if the historians consider a policy to be increasing taxation, I would code it as 1. If the historian consider the policies to be maintaining the status quo, I would give it a 0. If the historians think this policy is decreasing taxation, I would code it as -1. So the line here shows you the moving average of my codings. And again, you can see that in the first millennium, most of the policies were designed to increase taxation. And again, a turning point happened around the year 1000. In the second millennium, most of the policies were designed to either maintain the status quo or decrease taxation. This is very similar when we look at per capita taxation. This is measured in the Chinese traditional unit in the dan of rice. A dan of rice is equivalent to 4 gallons. So you can see that before the 11th century, per capita taxation increased, and then a turning point happened in the early Song dynasty. And then after that, Chinese per capita taxation continuously declined. There was one spike in the early Ming era, but the broader pattern is that in the second millennium, you see a rapid decline and also continuous decline of per capita taxation. Right? So the puzzle that motivated the whole book is the following. Why did short-lived rulers govern a strong state, and while long-lived rulers controlled a weak state? So there seemed to be this trade-off in Chinese history between ruler duration and state strengths. And also another very important question I try to address in the book is what factors led to the consolidation of an absolute monarchy, and also at the same time, the weakening of the Chinese imperial state. That is, toward the end of the imperial China, in the second half of imperial Chinese history from Song to Qing, we see a consolidation of an absolute monarchy. That is, the Chinese emperors became stronger and stronger. They became increasingly secure, but then the Chinese state became increasingly weak. How to explain this? How to explain, the consolidation of this monarchy, but also the weakening of the Chinese imperial state? The overarching argument I put forward in the book is the following, that I argue that the Chinese rulers faced a trade-off that I call the sovereign's dilemma. That is, a coherent elite that could take collective actions to strengthen the state was also capable of overthrowing the ruler. I want to elaborate this using 2 graphs, borrowing from network theories. And then I argue that there are 2 ideal types of elite social structures that I call elite social terrain. In the first ideal type, I call this star network, as shown here. And you can see this is, looks like a star. In the star network, there are 2 central politicians. And then the number here doesn't really matter. You can have 3, you can have 1,000, but those are central politicians, which means they are politicians who work in the national government. And then also at the same time, we also have a few local social groups in the periphery, right? Some are in the north, some are in the east, some are in the south. So they are in different geographic locations. And what distinguishes the star network is the ways in which those politicians and then social groups are connected with each other. So you can see that in the star network, the 2 central politicians are connected via social ties. And in the book, I focus on marriage ties. That is, in this case, for example, this central politician's daughter might be married to the son of this central politician. At the same time, each central politician is also connected with all of the local social groups, right? Say, for example, this politician's second daughter might be married to the son from this family, and then his son might be married to the daughter from this family. So you have this centrally connected network in the capital that connects all the central politicians, but also you have social ties that connect the center with all the peripheries. This is the star network. On the other hand, the second type that I call a bow tie network. in the bow tie network, you also have two central politicians. You also have those periphery social groups in different geographic locations. But this is very different from the star network in the sense that, first of all, the central politicians are not connected with each other. They are separated from each other. There's no social ties that connect the central politicians. At the same time, each of the central politicians is connected with social groups only in one geographic location. Say, for example, this central politician is connected with social groups only in the West, and this politician is connected with social groups only in the East. Therefore, their social ties are localized, not cross-regionally connected. So using these two stereotypes of social networks, I can generate very powerful hypotheses that help me understand the two dependent variables, the two outcomes that I care about. The first one is ruler duration. The second one is state capacity. It works in the following way. It's very intuitive. That is, for the star network, it's bad for ruler duration. You know, when the central politicians are connected with each other, but also when they have cross-regional ties, this is really bad outcome for the ruler, because the central politicians, when they're connected, they can coordinate, they can trust each other, they can take collective actions to overthrow the ruler when they want to, right? They also have the capacity to do so because they are connected with social groups in different geographic locations. They can mobilize local society against the central state, right? So this is really bad for ruler duration. But this is great for state capacity, because when the central politicians are connected, again, they can coordinate, they trust each other, they can take collective action to strengthen the state. When they want to make policies, for example, they can take collective action to strengthen the state. But also they have an interest in strengthening the central state because their family interests are dispersed everywhere in the country, right? You know, say, for example, they have some in-laws here, their aunts and uncles are in different places in the country. They have a strong interest in relying on the central state to provide protection over a large territory, right? Because they have family interests that are everywhere. It makes sense for them to pay tax, simply to pay taxes to the national government, which can protect the whole country, right? Doesn't make sense, say, for example, for them to rely on each individual family in different locations to have their own private organizations to protect themselves. It's very expensive to do that. It's also very redundant, right? You don't have to do that everywhere. You can just simply strengthen the central state, which can protect all the families all over the country, right? So they also have a strong incentive in strengthening state capacity in the star network. But conversely, the bow tie network is the opposite, right? In the bow tie network, this is great for the ruler, because when the central politicians are disconnected, they cannot coordinate, they cannot take collective actions against the ruler, right? At the same time, this is a bad outcome for state capacity, because for the same reason, that is, the central politicians, because they're disconnected, they cannot coordinate to strengthen the state. But also their interests lie at the local level, right? All their families, the extended family members are concentrated in one place. For example, if all your family are from Michigan, or in my case, all my families are from Beijing, from this one place, I don't have a strong interest in strengthening the national government. Why do I pay taxes to the national government, which can use my taxes to provide public goods, for example, in other places, for example, in Guizhou, right? Doesn't make sense to do that. So for those central politicians, their interests lie at the local level. They prefer to keep the resources at the local level in their own families, so that their own families can protect themselves, for example, through private militia, but also by providing local public goods, right? They don't have a strong incentive in strengthening the central government. So the bow tie network is great for ruler duration, but really bad for state capacity, right? So the idea of the whole book is to use these two network graphs to explain Chinese history in the last 2,000 years. It's a dramatic oversimplification, but they're very powerful. I will show you later that they can do a really good job in capturing the basic patterns in the last 2,000 years. And so the book starts with the Han Dynasty. I briefly talk about the Han Dynasty, but really go into the Sui and Tang dynasties, and then talk about the transition talk about from Song to the Qing to the fall of Imperial China. And then I argue that before the year 1000, basically, up until the Tang Dynasty, the Chinese elites should be best characterized as a star network. And we should expect to see high state capacity and low ruler survival. And starting in the Song Dynasty, I argue that the Chinese elites should be best characterized as a bow tie network, and we should expect to see low state capacity and high ruler survival. I'm happy to talk about the whole book. Maybe we can find a fireplace. I can talk about the whole thing. But today, I'm going to focus on this part of the book. I will start with the Tang Dynasty and talk about the transition, the so-called Tang-Song transition, and then talk about the Song Dynasty. So a small note on the data. It's really an accident how I discovered the data source. About 15 years ago, I went to the city of Xi'an. This is in the Shanxi province in the western part of China. And Xi'an is an old capital. It's probably the oldest capital in China. You all know that Xi'an was the capital since the Qin era, and then also the capital for the Tang Dynasty. But that's not the reason I went there. The main reason I went to Xi'an was because my wife hometown is in Xi'an. So we were dating at the time. So I went to Xi'an to visit my future in-laws. So this is really the story of how visiting in-laws can have a happy ending sometimes. So we went to downtown Xi'an. There was a temple that my wife took me to. And the temple amazingly has a collection of tombstones. Some of them are from more than 1,000 years ago from the Tang Dynasty, but a lot of them are from the Song Dynasty, for example, hundreds of years ago. And I was just walking in the temple, and then I was stopping in one of them. This is, the front and the back of a tombstone. This is from basically the prime minister, the chief counselor in the Northern Song Dynasty, named Fu Bi. And you can see that on the front side of the tombstone, it says the position, the honor, the name of the person. But then on the back side of the tombstone, there's a lengthy eulogy carved on the limestone. And then the lengthy eulogy will start with the family, the upbringing, and then the exams, the positions, the honors, the achievements of this person. But then at the end of the eulogy, it includes a short paragraph that talks about this deceased person's family. So, for example, this is the last part of the eulogy of Fu Bi, and then you can see that it talks about, he married the daughter of Yan Shu, so we now know the father-in-law of Fu Bi. And then they will say they had 3 sons. They will talk about the names and then the positions of all the sons. And then they also say they had 4 daughters. And then they will say, the first one married Feng Jing, and then the position of Feng Jing. So we now know all the important people in Fu Bi's immediate family, right? His father-in-law, and then his wife, and then his sons, and then his daughters, and then sons-in-law, right? And then what's really cool about this, compared with a lot of other sources, for example, genealogies, is that the tomb epitaphs are gender neutral. That is, if you look at the genealogies, right, only males are recorded. They don't talk about the females, the wives, the daughters. They are not recorded in the genealogies. So which, create a huge problem for scholars when we want to study women. For example, Patricia Ebry, pointed this out, that when we study genealogies, we really cannot study the women. But with the tomb epitaphs, we can really see all the people, gender neutral, all the men and also important women, the wives and also the daughters in this person's family. So that trip happened about 15 years ago. I was, a graduate student at Michigan and was working on my first book. So that trip just, happened, and then I forgot about it. And I was working on my first book on Chinese course. But then, about 7 years ago, I started working on this book, on Chinese history. And then the impression of that tombstone suddenly occurred to me, suddenly came to me, that I realized that if I can systematically collect the data from the tomb epitaphs, I should be able to map the whole kinship networks of Chinese elites more than 1,000 years ago, right? And then starting about 7 years ago, my research assistant and I started collecting very systematically the kinship network of Chinese elites from the Tang dynasty, from the Song dynasty, from the Ming dynasty, right? That took me about 5 years. It's a very tedious process because we have to recognize those characters and then match those names and then find the information, right? But it's such a fun process. And for the presentation today is based on the data set we're able to collect, which includes about more than 4,000 officials in the Tang and Song eras. And then we're also able to collect from the tomb epitaph, the tombstone, but also in consultation with the Chinese historical geographic database that Peter Bo put together here at Harvard, we're also able to collect more than 40,000 individuals in those central officials kinship networks. So those 4,000 officials, we define them as the people who work in the central government in the Tang or Song era and who held vice ministerial positions or above. And basically they are you can think of them as the central committee members in the Tang and Song era, right? Because in the contemporary era, the vice ministerial level is also the threshold where we call them the Gaogan, the advanced cadres in the Chinese Communist Party. So this is the Gaogan in the Tang and Song eras. One problem that I want to be very transparent about is for historical data like this, there's a huge missing list, right? You can imagine that people who are more famous, who are more connected, are more likely to have tomb epitaphs reserved until today, right? So, and in the data, which means that the data I'm able to collect, the 40,000 individuals are like that. They're more powerful, they're more connected. So therefore, in the descriptive statistics I will show you later, we should understand them as indicative rather than representative, right? They are the most important people in that era, not a random sample of all the people in that era. And then for all the statistical analysis, the regressions I do in the book, I use various techniques, for example, multiple imputation and controlling for the number of kin to account for the fact that some people are more recorded than others. So what the data tells us, for the Tang era, the historians have well documented, the works of Ibre, Tackett, show that there was a group of aristocratic families, basically, about 200 aristocratic families who ruled Tang China. And those aristocratic families, they lived in the capital areas, in the current city of Xi'an and Luoyang. They were also densely intermarried with each other, that they are embedded in a intermarriage network, and that they all live in the capital areas. This is also reflected in the data that I collected. That is, so here is based on the data collected on the marriage network of the central politicians in late Tang era, right? This is all the Gaogan in late Tang era and how they married with each other. So here, each node is a central politician, and then they are connected when they are embedded in a marriage tie. For example, this guy's son married to the daughter of this central politician. And you can see that everyone was connected with everyone else, at least indirectly, right? I don't know what happened to these two people. They don't hang out with other people, but most of the central politicians in the late Tang era were embedded in the densely connected marriage network, right? We can also look at how the central politicians connect with local families. So here, the larger nodes are the central politicians. You can see they all live in, Chang'an or Luoyang, the capitals in the Tang dynasty, but they married people from everywhere in the country, right? The smaller nodes are the families that are scattered everywhere in the empire. You can see that while the central politicians resided in the capital areas, but through marriage ties, they connected with local social groups that are scattered all over the country, right? It looks a lot like a star network. That is, in the center, they're well connected with each other, but also through marriage ties, the center connects with local social groups that are scattered all over the country, right? So what happened to this star network in the Tang dynasty? Unfortunately, in the late 9th century, China experienced some of its coldest years in the last 2,000 years. This is the graph is based on the data collected from scientists who work in the Science Academy in China. They collected, the temperature anomalies in the last 2,000 years in China, and you can see there are some warmer years, there are some colder years, and I also collected data on conflicts in the last 2,000 years in China based on the 24 histories, the 24 the official histories. And this graph, the blue bars, shows you the frequency, the number of mass rebellion battles in the last 2,000 years. And in this graph, the red bar shows you the frequency of external war battles in the last 2,000 years. And you can see that there's some correlation between the temperature anomalies and then the number of conflicts. Say, for example, in the colder years, you might realize peasant rebellions were more frequent, right? You can see that peasant rebellions were more likely to happen in the colder years. And that makes sense because, peasants were more likely to rebel during cold years because there were more likely to be a famine, and then peasants were more likely to rebel in those colder years. But also, interestingly, the external war battles were more likely to happen in the warmer years. For example, in the 11th century, 12th century, this is during the Song era, the northern nomadic tribes, for example, the Mongolians, were more likely to attack China in the warmer years. This also makes sense because in the warmer years, China was more likely to have a harvest. And then it's more appealing, right, for nomadic tribes to attack an agricultural state like China during the warmer years because there's something to grab, right? During the warmer years, they have harvest. It's more appealing to have a war with China. But I want to go back to this point about what happened in the late 9th century. That is, in the late 9th century, China had some of these coldest years in the last 2,000 years. And then as a result, there was also a spike of mass rebellion in the late 9th century. A lot of the mass rebellions were under the leadership of Huang Chao, a salt merchant. Huang Chao was a salt merchant at the time. Tang was selling permit licenses to sell salt, and then Huang Chao was not very happy about the fee he had to pay. So he led a rebellion called the Huang Chao Rebellion in the year of 880. And in the year of 881, the Huang Chao rebels conquered the capital city of Chang'an and then entered the city and then occupied the city for 2 years. This is well documented in the recent book by Nicholas Tackett. During the 2 years of occupation, from the year 881 to 883, the Huang Chao rebels killed almost all of the 200 aristocratic families who lived in the capitals at the time. There were some exceptions. There were some survivors, people who work in the provinces, for example, who were not in the capital, they survived. But most of the aristocratic families who lived in the capital cities were killed by the rebels in those 2 years of occupation. That changed the whole trajectory of Chinese history and also changed the social structure of the Chinese elites starting from the late 9th century. So starting in the 10th century, this is the beginning of the Song dynasty, the Chinese emperors faced a new problem. That is, they no longer have the 200 aristocratic families where they can draw the bureaucratic talents, right? It used to be the case in the Tang dynasty, for example, the emperors just look at the 200 families and choose the sons and grandsons from the 200 families. It's hereditary, right? There's no, there were some exams, but the exams really don't matter. It's about family pedigree. Starting in the 10th century, the emperors can no longer have this pool of candidates. So what they did is they expanded the civil service examination systems, started in the Sui dynasty, but really is in the early Song dynasty, the Northern Song dynasty, that the Chinese emperors started to systematically rely on the civil service examination system to choose bureaucrats, right? And then this new institutional way of choosing bureaucrats, this new political selection mechanism basically had a huge impact on the social relations, on the social networks of the Chinese elites. Right? So in the Tang dynasty, you had this centrally connected, the star network of aristocratic families, right? They were destroyed in the Huang Chao rebellion. Now in the Song dynasty, all the Chinese elites now are the smaller land-owning gentry elites, so-called gentry, right? They are the smaller land-owning elites that are scattered everywhere in the country. They own the land in different localities. Their dream is to send their sons and grandsons in the civil service examination system, and then they can work in the bureaucracy, right? And then that whole institutional change, also the the violence during the Huangchao Rebellion, dramatically changed the social structure of the Chinese elites starting in the 10th century. And this is by the historians, they Hardwell and Himes call this the localist turn of the Chinese elites. That is, used to be this cross-regional network of Chinese elites, but starting in the Song dynasty, the Chinese elites start to be localized, that their social relations start to be localized for two reasons, right? The first reason is that because of the importance of the civil service examination system, it made it very important to build local ties. There was a requirement at the time in the Northern Song dynasty that when you want to sit on the exam at a very local level, you have to get a recommendation from one of the local notables, someone who passed the exam before, right? You need to get a letter from him. And then that gave a huge incentive for the local landowning elite to build social relations, marriage ties, for example, with the local notables. But also because of the importance of the civil service examination system, it also raised the value of land holding. That is, land holding is now so important that you want to hold land in one locality, then you want to generate some income from your land holding, then use the income to invest in the education of your sons, your grandsons, and send them to the civil service examination system, right? And the land holding, that fixed assets basically tied the Chinese elites to one locality and then build their power bases there, right? And then, so starting in the Song dynasty, we start to see a very different type of Chinese elites, very different from the aristocratic class in the Tang dynasty. And this is also reflected in the data I collected. So here on the left, you see the marriage network of the central politicians in the Northern Song dynasty. This is from one reign, I think it's from the Shenzong reign, Song Shenzong in early Northern Song dynasty. So each node here is a central politician, again, a Gaogan, a central committee member in the Northern Song dynasty. And they have a tie when they have marriages, among their daughters and sons. For example, the daughter of this person might be married to the son of this politician. And you can see, compared with the Tang network, the Song network is less densely connected, right? You have many more people who are not connected with other people, more isolates, using the jargon of network analysis. And then also the ways in which the central politicians connected with local social groups are also very different from the Tang dynasty. So remember, in the Tang network, you have a centralized elites who live in the capital, and then they connected with social groups everywhere. But here you can see the larger nodes are the central politicians in the Northern Song. They're much more scattered. They're no longer congregated in the capital areas. The capital here is Bianliang, is in Kaifeng, current city of Kaifeng. Some people live in Kaifeng, but you have a lot of people who do not live in Kaifeng. They're more scattered, but also they tend to marry locally. You cannot probably see in this graph, but I will show you later that the central politicians, their marriage network tend to be more localized. That they tend to marry, for example, the daughters and sons of their neighbors rather than a family from far away. And just comparing those networks together, this is from the Tang era. This is the marriage network of the Tang Central Committee members, and these are the Song central politicians' marriage network in different reigns. From different emperors, from the Northern Song to the Southern Song. And one measure that network analysis often uses is the network density, which measures how connected they are, right? And then for the Tang network, you can see it has very high density, relatively high density, but this density dramatically declined, to almost half in the Song era. That is, the Song networks are less densely connected compared to the Tang era, right? In the book, I also construct an index to measure how localized their kinship networks are. That is, for example, do you measure, do you marry people? Do you send your daughters and sons, to families far away from you, or do you primarily marry people in your own neighborhood? And this index is a measure of that. That is, how localized this measure, with higher values means how localized your kinship network is. And with higher values means more localized. That is, you tend to marry families in your own neighborhood. And this are two examples of two networks from the Northern Song era. This basically, one of the chapters look at the Wang Anshi reform in the Northern Song dynasty. And this is basically the kinship network of Wang Anshi, a famous reformer from the Northern Song era. And you can see, Wang Anshi's hometown was here in Jiangxi. But his kinship network, the families that his sons and daughters, married into are from everywhere in the country. Some are from north, from the west, from the east. He has a more dispersed network. On the other hand, this is one of the opposition leaders' kinship network. So this person, hometown is here. And then you can see that his kinship network is much more concentrated. That is, his sons-in-law, for example, daughters-in-law, are primarily from nearby provinces, compared with Wang Anshi, right? This is a much more concentrated network. We can also calculate the average localization score for all the politicians from the Tang to the Song era. And then what this graph shows you is the changes of the average localization score, from the early Tang to the late Song. And then on the horizontal axis is the year when this cohort of politicians became major officials, when they became, the Gaogan, the central politicians, vice ministerial level and above positions, right? And then on the vertical axis is the average localization score of that cohort of politicians, right? And then you can see that in the Tang era, it has a very low localization score, which means that people tend to marry cross-regionally. They tend to marry people, from far away. But this localization score increased dramatically, almost double the Tang score in the Song era, right? Which means that in the Song era, people localized their social relations. They tend to marry people in their own localities rather than people, families far away from them. And this change in the elite social structure had a dramatic effect on politics in Chinese history. That is, when the elites became fragmented in the center, when you go to the capital and you realize that all the central committee members, all the most important, powerful politicians, they're no longer connected with each other. You see this fragmentation, right, in the central elites. This has a very strong effect on the monarchy. That is, the emperors were able to take advantage of the factional fights, for example, and then all the disconnections within the elites to consolidate monarchical power and able to lengthen the rule, right? Because now all the elites are not coherent, right? The rulers starting from the Song times, especially in the Ming era, we all know the story of how Zhu Yuanzhang consolidated his own power. But that's really part of this whole trend from the Song era, that the Chinese emperors were able to consolidate their monarchical power. And we also see longer and longer durations of Chinese rulers starting from the Song era, right? As a result of the fragmentation of the central elites. And at the same time as their social relations became localized, it also weakened their incentive to strengthen the central state. That is, starting from the Song era, starting from the failure of the Wang Anshi reform. And where in the book, I also look at, for example, the Zhang Juzheng's reform in the Ming era, there was some reform in the Qing era. You can see that the majority of the central elites, starting from the Song onward, had a strong incentive to maintain the status quo, that they don't want to change anything, right? They want to change the fiscal system, they want to increase taxation, they want to maintain the quota of the taxation, for example. They have no incentive in strengthening the central government. So that, so the localization of elite social networks starting in the Song era dramatically weakened the elite's incentive to strengthen the central state. And that's why we see, from the beginning of the talk, if you remember, the dramatic decline of taxation starting from year 1000 to the Qing era, right? So in the rest of the book, I talk about, the Ming era, the Qing era. I won't have time to go through those details, but just want to give you a sense of how late Imperial China looked like, as a result of the elite localization. This is just a graph based on the data I collected from genealogies. That is, those jiapu, those families that will compile those genealogies, and then from those genealogies we can identify the most powerful families in each locality, right? And then this shows you the geographic location of those families in the latter half of the 19th century. before the Opium Wars. So basically what happened in Imperial China in the late Qing era is, although there was still this centralized monarchy, right? There was, the ruler in the Forbidden City, but in China, every locality, there were 2 or 3 powerful families, land-owning families that controlled local politics, right? They started to control local governance. They started to capture the local government. They started to provide local public goods, dikes, irrigation were all controlled by the local families rather than the government. And also more importantly, starting in the late 19th century, during and after the Taiping Rebellion, the local families started to control the local means of violence. This is the opposite of what Max Weber called the monopoly over violence. Basically, in late Qing China, the Qing government lost its monopoly over violence. Local defense was controlled by the local families rather than the government. And then local militias, private militias started to mushroom, and then they started to control local defense. And this is what happened in late Qing. And this is how Qing China fell, right? Is, the local autonomous forces, controlled by the local elite families started to be more and more independent from the central state. And then in the year 1911, they declared independence from the central state. And then that's how the Qing government fell. That's also how Imperial China fell, right? So to summarize my argument, it's very, it can be summarized in one sentence, that is elite social terrain, that is the structure of Chinese elite social relations made the Chinese state. But after an exogenous shock, for example, during climate change and then mass violence, using this opportunity, the state can also reshape the elite social terrain. That's what happened in the Song dynasty. That is, using the power vacuum, after the Tang dynasty, the Song emperors were also able to reshape the elite social terrain, and then in the favor of the ruler, right? And this is very different from the trajectory that we're all familiar with in Europe. That is, in Europe is the opposite, where in Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, when you have political fragmentation, it created 2 dual transformations. On the one hand, you have feudalism, very fragmented kingdoms, and then in those kingdoms you have representative institutions, parliaments, for example, where the elites can bargain with the kings and the queens, and they don't have to kill the kings and the queens, right? And then lengthened the ruler duration in Europe. At the same time, according to Charles Tilly, we all know that when those kingdoms started to fight with each other, that strengthened the European state. So in Europe, you have a more durable rule and then stronger state capacity at the same time. But in China, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off that I call the sovereign dilemma. That is, you can get ruler duration or state capacity, but not both. I have some slides about contemporary implications, but I want to stop here so that we can have some time for discussion. So I'll stop here and stop sharing the screen and hand this over to Nico.
Super. Thank you so much, Yuhua. You've caused me to reconsider European history, Chinese history, and more. So we have a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A banner. So I encourage everyone who's listening to do that. And what I'll try and do is select some of the questions and read them out, and then Yuhua can address them. This is from, I think it's Xue. Professor Wang, why do you use tax to measure the capacity of a dynasty? What if some emperors intentionally lower the tax rate? For example, in the early period of the Han Dynasty, Wendi Emperor and Jingdi Emperor charges were very low. They charged a very low tax, and Wendi even abolished the agricultural tax.
Yes, I assume that all rulers, with some exceptions maybe, but basically all rulers, want more revenue, right? That's it's a reasonable assumption, I think, right? Because you talk about the Han Dynasty, and then in various dynasties in China, not only the Han Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang froze the quota. There was a fixed quota that he used, and then throughout the Ming Dynasty, and also had a huge influence on the Qing Dynasty, that the central government could only collect this amount of taxation from the whole country, even with population growth, territorial expansion from Ming to Qing, but there was a quota, right? So clearly, I see your point. That is, some rulers want to lower taxation, but that's the point, right? The point is, that is, they, in both, in all those dynasties, in the Han in particular, but also in the Song, in the Ming, they faced very severe external threats. The Song, the Han was having war with the Xiongnu, right? That's the nomadic tribe. The Song was having war with, all the northern kingdoms in, by Tangus, by the Mongolians, right? And then, so they all need more money, but the reason why they have to lower tax, I argue in the book, is because the elites, right? The elites didn't have a consensus about taxation. That is, they do not want to strengthen taxation. They do not want to increase taxes because their own interest will be harmed by the high tax rate. So I would assume that rulers all want high taxation, but whether they can increase taxation depends on whether the elites supported such policies.
So Yuhua, we have a couple of questions, but we don't have much time. I'm going to ask you one specific question, which goes to your model and a part of it, but then everyone's asking about what the contemporary implications are for your model. So I want to make sure you get to that. But here's the specific question. This is from Tyler Chen, who's a mere student at the University of Michigan. You treated chaos caused by Huang Chao as a critical juncture in the transformation of elite relations. However, some conventional ideas hold that Huang's success was partially due to the fact that local elites were not unified enough to fight against them. If pre-Song elites have strong internal ties, why did they fail to stop Huang's move in the first place?
Well, that's a great question. I think, the Tackett book, Nicholas Tackett, talk a lot about this. Well, I think that, the Tang state was strong, right? Compared with other dynasties in China, relatively terms, right? But it's right that, why, how do we explain, the success of Huang Chao rebellion if the state was so strong? Well, I think the paradox here is that the state capacity was strong, but then also there was one vulnerability of the Tang elite. That is, the Tang elites were so concentrated, right? They were so concentrated in the capital. They're now scattered. Therefore, so the power structure, there were a lot of power, there were a lot of capacity, but the capacity was concentrated in the capital, in Chang'an and Luoyang. That has two effects. One is, the localities were not well controlled, right? And that's what you are getting at. But also, more importantly, it makes the central elites very vulnerable to mass rebellions. That is, once they're so concentrated in the capital. Once you conquer the capital, you can kill all of them. Right? That's what happened. Imagine a scenario, an alternative scenario where the elites are scattered. In that sense, it will be very difficult for the rebellions to kill all the autocrats, right? Because they're everywhere, right? But they were all concentrated in the capitals, so it's so easy for the rebels to kill all of them.
So we just, as I say, we have 5 minutes left, but I'm sure you can address this in many ways. Lots of questions about what the implications are with respect to contemporary China and state power, ruler durability. So I wonder if you could open up your model to apply history to understand the present.
Well, I do think that there are some differences. We now have a party, and then the party is, an institutionalized organization that can regulate elite behavior, but also we have, a higher penetration of the state into the societies. That's very different from imperial China. Just look at what happened during the pandemic. The neighborhood committees. But I do want to say there's one key lesson, I guess. We can draw from imperial China. That is, when we look, why. Think about why imperial China fell, right? Why this, 2,000-year empire, so dominant in the world, fell. One of the key reasons, I think, is the interest of the ruler to consolidate their own rule by fragmenting the elites, right? And that's what happened starting in the Song dynasty. That is, the Chinese emperors cared so much about their own power. They want to centralize their own power. They want to stay in power for a very long time. And then the only way to do this is to fragment the elites. They cannot have a coherent elites, right? When they have a coherent elites, they got assassinated, like Jingzong in the Tang dynasty. So the way they do this is to fragment the Chinese elites, right? Make them disconnected with each other. Therefore, they can exploit the factional fights among them and then strengthen their own power. So I think that's the final culprit, I think, for the fall of Imperial China. That is the rulers' single-minded pursuit of personal power undermined the state, but also leads to the fall of the whole dynasty, right? And then, that has some lesson, I guess, for contemporary China. That is where, we're seeing, another ruler in China who is trying to maximize his own power, try to maximize his duration, in office. And then, according to the lesson from Imperial China, we know, as a result of that, he needs to fragment the elites. That's what happened during the anti-corruption campaign, right? He was trying to fragment the elites, make them disconnected with each other. And then, from the lesson from Imperial China, we know that that's bad for the state, right? When the central elites are fragmented, the Chinese state became weaker, right? Because that's the main lesson I learned from Imperial China.
So I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator, just ask you a quick question and go back to the main thrust of your book. Some of the analysis seems to be devoid of taking account of the massive external shock that China understood, whether it was social elites or networks or just government power. Do you want to comment on why the fall of the Qing dynasty may have happened in a specific way that departs from your model, or do you see that your model holds even for the Qing?
Yeah, I think the external shocks certainly accelerated the fall of Qing. Right? For example, without the Opium War, for example, Qing would fall, but would still fall, but fall maybe later, right? But I think that what I want to argue in the book is the long-term change in the social structure of the elites, starting from the Song era, really, got accelerated in the Ming and Qing. That is the localization of the elites, and then the fragmentation of the central elites, right? That's a long-term trend before the Opium Wars. So without the Opium War, we'll still see this trend that brought down the Qing dynasty. But with the Opium War, which dramatically weakened the central state, it accelerated the tendency of localization. That is, after the Opium War, especially during the Taiping Rebellion, the local elites had a stronger incentive to control local governance and then become, form local militias. And then I think those independent social forces were probably the most important reason that brought down the Qing dynasty. But I think without the Opium War, that still could happen, but just maybe later.
Well, I think we're about there. I don't know if Ina comes back in, or do I just thank Wang Yuhua for the not only stimulating talk, but also the book that is behind it. And we all look forward to its publication, end of this year, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, October 2022. Yeah.
All right. So on behalf of your old comrades at Michigan, we thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much, Nico. Such a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.